DevOps he did right at the beginning of DevOps Days Minneapolis last year. What you probably don't know is that we asked him to do that, I want to say maybe like a day or two beforehand, and he just managed to produce it pretty much instantly on command. So Donnie has a really good grasp of the space. Being an analyst in the space, if you don't know what a research analyst in tech does, basically they understand everything that we're all doing, and then they look at the data, make predictions, and do research on it, which is really interesting. So I think Donnie is pretty much the perfect person to give everybody here kind of an idea about what people in the DevOps movement are working on and thinking about today. He'll probably ask you some questions about, yourselves and where you're at, but in general, can we get one more show of hands for the people who came to one of our previous DevOps Days events? Yeah, so a few people have, but a lot of people maybe haven't even seen this particular sort of content. So please give it up for Donnie Berkholz.
Awesome. So I may occasionally step over the side because I'm still enjoying one of these fine beverages. So we are indeed going to ask you some questions during this talk. In fact, I always like to kick off with a question. So the person asked how many of you have been to a DevOps Days. How many of you have been to a DevOps event ever? Here? About half. So welcome to the other half of you. Thank you for coming tonight. This is great. I hope you come back again. Some of the talks are more technical than others. This is a one-on-one talk, so don't expect a ton of super deep content, but one thing that even if you've been doing DevOps for a while, I hope you will appreciate is we're just talking a little bit about analyst firms. We do research on what's happening in a space. So I've been doing research sort of on DevOps as a concept, as a community, as a movement for the past probably 6 or so years now. And we do, at my new employer, which I joined about 9 months ago, we do a lot of surveys. So we'll go out and ask 1,000 people, trying to be pretty representative about it, about where people are. So where are people with DevOps? And sort of specific breakdowns of what DevOps actually means, all these different practices that they get up. And I think for those of you who have been doing this for a while, it might be interesting to see where you stand. Are you sort of still on the bleeding edge? Are you pretty typical? Or, if you're behind, there might be some ammunition for you to say, hey, we're behind, we need to catch up. Otherwise, we're going to be, there's a great graph by Simon Wardley, who you should go look up if you haven't seen it on Twitter before, on what enterprise software adoption looks like. And it basically looks like, nope. Oh, crap. Now we better pick it up. And if you're one of those companies, this might give you a little bit of ammunition to say, hey, you know what? We've been doing this DevOps thing on the team level. Maybe we should go pick it up a little bit more broadly, because the bottom-up perspective works really nicely from the tools point of view of DevOps. It doesn't work so well from the culture point of view. From a bottom-up level, it's very difficult to reorganize teams, reorganize groups to build that kind of collaborative environment you're looking for. So with that, I thought I'd kick it off a little bit at very high-level data. And like I said, DevOps needs that top-down perspective. And so we do a lot of talking to developers and DevOps engineers, which is really just the new sysadmin, and sort of everybody in between. But we also do a lot of talking to directors, VPs, CIOs, that sort of thing. And one of the things we ask that kind of audience is, how do you collaborate with the business, which is really a big picture of DevOps, right? How do you work more closely with the business? How do you build that collaborative environment to do the right kinds of stuff and do it more quickly? And what we saw over time is that the businesses and the CIOs are really looking to become much more collaborative, right? They're looking to change from being sort of minimizing cost, minimizing dollars, thinking only from a dollar-centric perspective, to thinking about things from a much more agility-centric and risk-centric perspective, which is really, from the business value point of view, what DevOps is all about, right? How do we become more agile? How do we be the Netflix in our market, whether it's Netflix or Airbnb or Zenefits in insurance or Tesla in cars, or you can sort of pick an industry and there's going to be somebody like that. And everybody else in there is like, oh crap, we got to keep up with that now, right? Otherwise we're going to go out of business and we can even see it happening now that there's a startup doing this in our space. And so everybody now is sort of in that top, on this graph, that top sort of light blue and orange portion of how do we lower risk, how do we speed time to market, instead of how do we focus on dollars and cents. And that's growing over time. This is data from I guess now, about a year and a half ago, is the most recent set. But you can see this increasing over time. And I don't expect you to actually be able to read any of this stuff. The key point on this is unsurprisingly, if you ask people if they would like to move faster, they say yes. If you say, would you like to deliver software more quickly? They're like, yep, we would. But the weird thing about it is only 2/3 of them do. The other third says, no, we're good. And you can see, a lot of conservative industries, they say, well, you know what, our business processes, our physical processes can't actually keep up with the things we're already doing. And so it's not even in our interest to keep up, which is, I think, a really important perspective to keep in mind, in that the rest of the company has to be able to cope with the speed of delivery that DevOps will bring you. And so if you're thinking, oh, we're going to be doing continuous delivery, we're going to be doing continuous deployment, and someone else in business, they say, well, you know what, we're building mining machines, we can only build those once every 18 months. If you're able to deliver software more quickly, I'm not sure we can cope with that. We can't really do anything about that. And maybe in the long term, you can move something that looks like a Tesla with a LCD or LED dashboard. But in the short term, a lot of these companies are actually limited. And so, from a selfish point of view, as you, people who want to be doing DevOps, maybe that isn't the industry you want to be in. So just sort of keep that in mind. But in the big picture, the point that is worth making is about 2/3 of people, which is the very top, the luminous green at the top there, about 2/3 of people want to be moving faster, right? Everybody wants to be moving faster. No matter how fast they're moving, they want to say, yes, more and more and more and more. You may have seen this before. I'm sure you have, in fact. How many of you use open source software on a daily basis? Most of you. Excellent. How many of you use some kind of public cloud, IaaS or PaaS, on a daily basis? About 2/3. All right. And so these things happen. Right? Technology adoption is more and more bottom-up, which the point I'm trying to make here is you have more power than you ever did. In terms of making choices that determine what the company's going to do now across the board. And those choices for the past 15 years have been things like Linux, MySQL, more recently Mongo would be a great example of this. One that, if you're coming from the system inside, you may not particularly appreciate, but you can understand, is empowering developers to get things done more quickly. When it comes to being scalable and maintainable, it's a different question. But it certainly does reflect the power of bottom adoption, which I'm showing you here with a picture of sort of Cathedral versus the Bazaar, which is a very famous essay on my recommendation. And so things are becoming more and more powerful practitioners, which puts more power in your hands to do the right thing, more authority in your hands to do the right thing. So every time you pick a technology, you start playing around with it, and you deploy some toy app that turns out to be around 15 years later, long after you've left, think about the power that is placed in your hands, because it's a lot more power than it used to be. From a developer perspective, this is shadow IT in action. Right? They pick whatever they want. They could go public cloud if they want to. The New York Times is a fantastic example of this. They moved to public cloud, and they happened to move to Amazon. And the reason they did is because they were buying books with it, and that could get through their finance department. So be careful and be wary of the power you have been given, because it can go for better or for worse. It can go a long ways. This is just a little bit of data on this. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this intro stuff. I want to get a little bit deeper into the DevOps area. But I thought you might be interested in seeing exactly how empowered you are if you're a practitioner today. This is a question survey of 1,736 people. Who are the stakeholders, who's involved in decision making? And the really important point out of this, I think, is over here at the infrastructure managers, architects, developers. You are enormously powerful influencers in technology adoption. In this particular instance, happens to be cloud providers and hosting providers, but it holds true across the board. So a lot of times I wave my hand around and point at things and say, oh, bottom adoption, yeah. Here's some really good data to say, like, this is a thing, right? If you make recommendations, they more and more often get adopted, right? Have any of you seen the 7 Red Lines video on YouTube? A few of you. So it's this great video. You just gotta go check it out after you get back. What happens in this video is it really reflects the way sales meetings used to go, and then the way they are going today is the part that's not in that story, right? The way they used to go is some vendor would bring in some high-level salesperson and some sales engineer, right? Some demo monkey, right, would be the old approach. On the buyer side, there's somebody who's like, oh, well, I've got a business need, but I don't really understand anything about the tech. And what would happen is the buyer would say, you know what we're looking to draw 7 red lines. We'd like each of those lines to be perpendicular to the other one. And the sales engineer gets up there, he starts drawing on the whiteboard, he's like, all right, we can draw 1, we can draw 2, we can even draw 3. Even if we imagine time as a dimension, we could maybe sort of imagine there being 4. We can't do 7, right? We can't do superstring theory here with technology today. And so we're a little bit limited. And that's the way that technology looks like to a lot of these sort of high-level line of business buyers, the people who have been buying technology traditionally. That's why I'm showing you this data about how you're becoming more powerful, because that's changing, right? More and more what we see is, we see sysadmins, DevOps, if you will. I hear people are hiring a DevOps, if you would like to be one, and developers, and they're all getting brought into these sales meetings, right? And they're getting brought in as experts from the technical level to say, hey, here's what we actually need this solution to provide. We need APIs, we need it to be compatible with Chef or Puppet or Ansible or Salt or whatever. We need it to provide some kind of billable hourly interface. We can't work the way we used to. And so, things don't happen anymore by heading over to the golf course and playing a golf and saying, oh, Salt. And so, the last thing I want to talk about before we sort of get into the real meat of this is what the new stack looks like. Because I think this really ties into how we maintain, how we deploy the new stack. What is in the new software stack? This is a journalism site that I highly recommend. I'm slightly biased because I do a podcast with them, but I think they do pretty sharp stuff. They read a lot about Docker and Mesos and sort of all that sexy new technology. But in reality, the new stack is not just Docker. You're not done when you say Docker. The new stack is an infinite array of stacks. Technology is more fragmented than it has ever been. There's no such thing as the right answer anymore. It used to be 15, actually about 20 years ago, I quantified this, and I can show you the numbers afterwards if you're interested. Because I like to do bars and pull up my PowerPoint decks and start talking about that. The technology is more fragmented than it's ever been. 20 years ago, if you said, I want to satisfy 80% of all software development, what are my programming languages? What do I have to do? There were 3 of them. You could do it with Java, C and C++, and .NET. You're done. If you wanted to get to that same 80% today, it would take you 10 languages. Now, you can imagine, most of you, I'm guessing, are not software vendors yourselves, or at least not developer and operational infrastructure software vendors. But you can imagine how complex this makes things for them. Right? When they say, oh, well, we can't just say, like, here's the SDK, we're good. It's like, oh, crap, what do we do now? Well, let's see. Oh, I know, we can implement an API. We don't have to care about languages anymore. Now we're good, right? They can all write their own code. And that's how things have gone for about the past 10 years now, right? Ever since Amazon came out with S3 and EC2, and we've seen more and more APIs across the board. And it's because, in part, that people can't cope with all the fragmentation that's happening. And I think the reason I want to talk about this right now is this is really driving everything else that's happened, right? So fragmentation means people don't have time to learn about technology for a long time, which means people make choices quickly, which means we see things like Mongo getting really popular because it's super easy to get it running with, which means all kinds of different things about adoption of frameworks, databases, languages, take your pick. Whatever is easiest to use tends to get adopt much more than whatever is the most right in the wrong one. This isn't brand new either. This goes back to the days of things like MySQL versus Postgres. And so, we're going to talk high-level stuff for a little while. I apologize. How many of you think you know what DevOps is? Come on, raise your hand. Feel free. Feel free. Okay, now tell the person next to you. No, just kidding. How many of you can define it to somebody else? So, right, we've got 5. It's hard to define. We all talk about doing DevOps, and I'm just going to tell somebody else what it actually looks like to do it. And I'm very happy about that, because that means I have a job. And so we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about this, because it'll be very familiar to many of you. But there are a few different ways I think about DevOps. And again, from your selfish perspective, when you're trying to describe this to somebody, or you're trying to say, here's what our company should be doing, I'm trying to give you some ammunition to power. Or if you're not familiar with it yourselves, here's a good way to think about it from a few different levels, depending on the kind of person you are. And I think it's very different thinking about DevOps, whether you're coming in from a business perspective, or a development perspective, or an operational perspective. So I'm going to give you some tools from each of those. But at the very highest level, how many of you are familiar with Agile software development? Yeah, about 80%. So, there you go. There it is, done. All right, thank you for coming. So DevOps just looks like Agile all the way across the process, right? Take Agile development, push it out to production, and pull it back to the business, and you've got something that looks a whole lot like DevOps, right? Because the whole point is, and this is something that I think has been really a misunderstanding of all of us since the get-go in most cases, because DevOps really started thinking about things like Agile infrastructure, is we need to be thinking about things from the perspective of the business, and not just developers working with ops, which I think is the biggest transformation that you, me, all of us need to make, is how do we collaborate more closely with the business to deliver the right things to the customers, and then to fix them as quickly as possible. Which I think is really critical. And if you take nothing else out of this whole talk tonight, take this back and say, look, if we're going to do DevOps right, we have to be able to ship things to our customers, to our users more quickly, and then fix them more quickly. So that we didn't spend, let's see, Judge Humble is one of the guys behind continuous delivery, calls it water scrum fail. So that we didn't spend months planning something, and then iterated on it so wonderfully in this DevOps process between development and ops and testing. And then finally said, okay, we're ready to go prod 18 months later. Yeah, you're laughing because you're familiar with it, because you've seen it happen. It happens all the time. And that's what I'm trying to get you to move away from. Because I showed you at the very beginning, this super high level stuff is the business wants to be more agile. The business wants to lower the risk. They don't care as much about dollars and cents if you can make an argument that IT matters to the company, which I think is the mindset that has to happen, right? If you're a director, if you're a VP, if you're a C-level IT person, I would love to see any non-IT C-suite people here. That'd be great. Doesn't have to do often. The argument that they are making right now, or that they should be making, is that IT is critical to the future of the company, and not just critical to keeping the lights on. And that's why I keep talking about this. The background picture, by the way, is not because the F-35 was an outstanding example of agile processes, but because I wanted to talk about a military concept, because the only two metaphors we get in IT are military and sports. I want to talk about a military concept that's been advanced by Adrian Cockcroft and others called OODA, right? Observe, Orient, Decide, Act, which is really an agile process in action. You can go Google it later if you want to. The point is, whoever can do that whole loop faster than their competitors is the one that wins, right? The one that can deliver the right thing to the customers more quickly. And this sounds like sort of high-level business stuff that you find in some book in your MBA's library. But don't let yourself blow that off, because this is the shift that you have to make, is thinking about the business, not just thinking about the IT. Because if you can think about that, that is going to make your career go a whole lot farther. And so I think about IT or DevOps really as three pillars. Some people think about it as four, I like three. We can argue about that for as many hours as you would like to. The three that I think about, and these are pillars we have in here, it's a very famous constellation, nebula. Culture, automation, measurement. Some people tack on sharing. I think about that as part of culture. I don't want to argue about semantics, and so we can not do that now and do that at some other point. But you might see the acronym CAMS over time, and this is what they're getting at. Culture, automation, measurement, sharing, culture. Just pretend you didn't hear that part. So these are really the three pillars, and I think it's really important. I've been talking about DevOps for a long time now. The problem is that we mostly talk about DevOps as like, here's the idea, instead of here's why we should do these things. And so, I really want to change that conversation and talk about here's the point of doing this stuff in the first place, right? So we're always talking about, okay, here's DevOps. We should tear down the silos. We should collaborate more closely. That sounds great. And it does sound great. I would love to collaborate more closely. How do I convince anybody else that that is worth the time of doing? Because any executive worth their salt knows that reorgs suck. Anybody at the ground level worth their salt knows that reorgs suck. Right? A lot of times they involve layouts, which are not fun. A lot of times they involve things like stack ranking, also not fun. A lot of times they involve things like focusing on bureaucracy versus getting work done. Not fun. And so what's the point of this whole culture idea, right? The point is, let's see, if you think about software delivery as a process, you think step by step by step, what does it take to deliver software in production from building requirements? Every time you create another barrier, you're building up another queue. Read about things like queuing theory. And I'm sitting here thinking Charlie Betts is just imagining these books that he's read in the audience. There are many people in product management, Don Reinertsen, right? You're thinking that book, I know you are. Don Reinertsen, I actually bought this book over the winter vacation and read it. He's got some great numbers to quantify, thinking about introducing additional steps into the delivery process and the whole lean idea as applied to software delivery. Every additional step you introduce creates an additional queue, slows things down, introduces additional delays. The more of the steps you're able to eliminate by getting rid of silos and putting people on functional teams, so when I say functional, I mean cross-functional teams, product-driven teams, right? Think the way that Apple is organized, but maybe not quite that extreme, because that's hard to do right. The more you're able to do that, put things like developers, ops, testing, security, even marketing, business analysts, production support, ops, whatever you call the term, the more you're able to put all those people on the same team, the more barriers you eliminate, the faster you're able to deliver software, the faster you're able to iterate to build the right thing. The more barriers you have in that process, the slower you can deliver, the worse of a job you do. So that is the reason for the cultural transformation, right? We always talk about breaking down cultures. Empathy is great. I agree, empathy is great. I agree, getting along is wonderful, and we should all hug all day long. But when you're making an argument to the business, this is the argument you have to make, right? You can deliver more quickly without artificial barriers in place. But also, you do get the empathy. And like I said, it's all hugs, it's great. But additionally, the empathy gives you more insight into product management. Right? We heard people talking about product management earlier today. If you understand what the other users of your software look like, whether they're internal or external, you can do a better job of building the right thing. Just imagine, because a lot of times what happens with software, I've seen this so many times, is you have these developers, they'll go build some code, it'll be cool, it doesn't scale. It doesn't log. It can't do clusters, it can't do high availability, it can't do anything that you need it to do in production. And so you have to go back and say, oh, yeah, let's make that one cluster. And they say, all right, that's going to look like a re-architecture from scratch, folks. That's not going to be feasible for a while. We can't justify that. All right, so I guess what we'll do then is we'll put a bunch of load balancers in front, and we'll set up a cron job to kick the JVM every hour. I'm sure you've never done that. But by breaking down these silos, putting people in the same room so that they can act as internal liaisons to build the right thing in the first place, you can get rid of those kinds of problems. The second pillar is automation, right? And the metaphor that I'm not the first person to talk about, Randy Bias is, I think, the first person to talk about it. He used to be the CTO of Cloud Scaling and had a nice sale to EMC last year. Talks about the metaphor of cattle versus pets. How many of you have heard of this? It's about maybe 30-40%, right? For the rest of you, in short, the idea is, look, we used to maintain our servers like pets. We would, whether it's a cat, I'm not sure exactly what the mouse metaphor should be there, but whether it's a cat or a dog or a parrot or a ferret, you would give it a name at birth, you would carefully nurture it up, you'd build out a wonderful gold master, let it have children, and when there was a problem, you would take it to the vet, and you would say, oh, this is a problem, we've got to spend a lot of effort on fixing this one, right? Because this one is Spock. This one is Captain Kirk. Whatever your crazy server naming scheme is, and there are way too many that are sci-fi. But whatever they are, everybody was carefully nurturing the characters. They bonded to them as individuals almost, right? They were anthropomorphized servers. But that's not the case in this DevOps world. And it's not the case for a lot of reasons, right? And I think some of the reasons are, one, you cannot scale Spock. You cannot, well, Spock is not the best example for automation. You cannot scale the ring person. What is the ring thing from Lord of the Rings? Yeah. What's the one I said? Oh, migrations. Yeah, Gollum, there you go. Yeah, Gollum doesn't automate. You can't automate Gollum. You can't scale Gollum. So you can't reproduce Gollum whenever you want to, which is a problem, right? You can't make Gollum go faster, because there's a Gollum. You've always got to talk to a Gollum in the middle of the process. And so why would you automate? Well, it's the mindset shift of that pet peeve of Calendar, right? Okay, I've got Gollum. Actually, what I'm looking to have is a herd of Golems, a herd of cattle, right? And this metaphor actually goes over incredibly poorly in India, so I advise you not to use it there. But if one of the cows gets sick, what you do is you take it up back and you shoot it, and then you have a wonderful dinner. Or you give the steak to your friend. And so it's that mindset shift from carefully named individuals to saying, I've got a fleet. I don't care about individuals in that fleet, I've got a fleet. I think about things from the fleet-centered point of view. And this is now pretty common from an automation perspective, pretty common thinking about infrastructure as code. Where it's not really common yet, which surprises me, is monitoring. Right? People tend to still be very server-centric in the way they monitor things. People haven't really moved up in most cases to a service-centric perspective, right? They say, oh no, mail server 17 is gone, crap, what do I do? I'm like, well, nothing. That's what self-healing infrastructure means, right? The whole point is, you've got some cluster manager that says, you know what, there's supposed to be 20 of them. If one of them dies, I don't care. I don't want to get some obvious notification in my email. I don't want to see anything. All I want to know is when this cluster is approaching a dangerous point, not when a server is gone. That's when I want to get notifications. That's when I need to take action. It turns out most monitoring software can't handle that right now. There's a few new ones just in the past year or two that can. We'll get into microservices a little bit later. But that's the way things need to go. So automation, right? We've got two perspectives. And I talked a little bit about how people going into DevOps. We've talked a lot about the business perspective. The second one is the ops perspective. How many of you, just out of curiosity, how many of you started as sysadmins? How about as developers? am so excited. This is the first meetup I've been at that more people said developers and sysadmins. Thank you for coming. I'm so happy to have you here. Seriously, I spent the last 3 years doing a rant about how developers weren't showing up with this stuff. And so now that you are, it's amazing. Please come to DevOps Days. Thank you for that. You can do DevOps in Windows. Awesome. PowerShell VSC. It's the way of the future. Right, so there's people coming into things from different perspectives, right? We've got infrastructure as code. The point again being, so we're thinking about us versus cattle. We're thinking about how do we replicate any given server, and how do we make sure we can scale it to arbitrary points. Because what this is all building towards in the long term from the encapsulation point of view is microservices eventually, right? Saying, yeah, we need clusters of everything. We don't care about individual servers. We're just going to need clusters of clusters of clusters of clusters and turtles all the way down. And so we've got infrastructure as code. One example I love to trot out about this is, have you heard of Net Capital? All right, 1 person, 2 people, 3 people, 4, 5, 6. Wait, you're all raising your hands now. I'm not going to talk about this. Okay, so Net Capital was a high-frequency trading firm. Y'all familiar with those? Yeah, familiar with what they're doing to our economy? Yeah. Or what they're doing to make next one. More importantly. So, Net Capital managed to lose $500 million. Managed to lose $500 million in the span of about 45 minutes. And they did so, in my point of view, by failing to automate their servers. Because what they did was they reused feature flag that we used about 10 years ago or so, called PowerPeg. Not that you care, but it gives the story a little bit of color. So they reused the feature flag from 10 years back and deployed it manually, of course, because that's the way you did things. They deployed it manually to 7 out of their 8 production servers. Then they turned the feature flag on. Their 8th one did something completely wrong, started losing their money. And they're like, oh crap, this thing sucks. What do we do? How do we fix it? We simulated this and we know this algorithm works. It took them 45 minutes to figure out what's going on. Back it comes out, pushing things forward, moving them side to side, all that good stuff. 45 minutes later, they're a trading firm. $500,000 gone. I contend that this is because of 2 things. They fail to think about their infrastructure in a panel perspective. You think about their production servers that they cluster. And they fail to automate their deployment process and their server environment. If they had done either of those things, ignoring the entire human process angle, you don't even have to think about human process. You don't have to think about checklists and ITIL and all of those things. I mean, if they had done those things, this would not have happened. They would still be in business. They would not be acquired for basically $0 by some other trading company. So that was the server level. Now we've got the development perspective, which is coming in from the basically application pipelining. Here's a diagram I did not create, but I really appreciate and enjoy. And I love to share it with people who are trying to understand what it looks like from really not even 20,000 feet, it's more like 40,000 feet, of what these processes look like when you put them all together, right? So we were talking earlier about Agile, bringing Agile to prod. And what does that look like? Well, let's introduce continuous integration. We ran a survey of DevOps leaning companies about a year and a half back now, and said, what are you doing for CI? And about two-thirds of the people who were interested in DevOps already said, yeah, we're doing CI. Half of them had some kind of weird homegrown thing. The other half said, yeah, we're using something real. Yeah. Whether it's open source or proprietary or whatever, often Jenkins or at the time when Hudson was fairly popular as well. The other third, so we said 2/3 were doing some kind of CI. The other third of people who wanted to do DevOps were doing nothing. They just weren't doing CI at all. And they said, oh, we're interested in DevOps and we've automated our server environment. And that's all cool and we can scale out to infinity. but we still can't deploy quickly, so what's the point of all that stuff? Right? Because the point of DevOps is being able to iterate as a business, not being able to keep the lights on and do a better job of reducing costs. Because if you care about your job, the jobs of your teams, you need to think about collaborating with the business and delivering the things that they care about. And the things they care about are, out-competing everybody else in their market, whatever it happens to be, whether it's retail or IoT or Scotch tape or anything else that happens to be in Minneapolis. So now I want to break out and show you a little bit more data for those of you who are already pretty familiar with the DevOps stuff. This is a survey we ran. The results just came out on Christmas Eve. And we asked people, almost 1,000 of them, 843, answered this particular question, of what their processes look like. And what you can see, can you read this in the back, by the way? Yes, no? Yes, cool, nice. What you can see is that most people are still mostly manual processes. We've been asking questions along these lines for a long time now. And in general, what we see is that at a high level, 2/3 of IT shops are about 2/3 virtualized. And the rest of them aren't at all. Of those 2/3, the other 1/3 of the shops who have virtualized, a third of their infrastructure is all manual. So people are moving along this process pretty slowly, right? That's virtualized. We're not even talking about things like automated infrastructure using backgrounds, like orchestration, like private cloud or public cloud or any of that stuff, right? If you're doing that today, and a significant chunk of your company is doing that, you're still way, way out there on the beginning or leading edge, despite public cloud being around for 10 years now. When we talk to these people, we've got, I think, something like 25 or 30,000 people on our panel now that we go and ask on a quarterly basis about what they're doing. When we talk to them, we still see that cloud as a whole is just crossing the chasm, if you've ever heard that phrase. Just starting to reach the mainstream. Everybody who's done cloud, up till today, is still an early adopter. So, congratulations to all of you for being early adopters and seeing the value of cloud. Like you can see down here, automation orchestration, 7%, right? Hardly anybody has moved on beyond that. But the problem is, we all hang out at DevOps meetups and at DevOps Days events and at velocity conferences and whatever, and we hang out with the crowd of people who are doing exactly what we're doing. We don't realize how far back everybody else is. So I think, from that empathy perspective we were talking about earlier, it's really important to realize how far behind most of the industry is when it comes to leading edge IT, right? That's why we call it leading edge. We're mostly not doing it. And so the third pillar is measurement. This is measurement from two perspectives. One of them is just straight out IT monitoring. And we talked a little bit about this earlier, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. The other perspective is measuring your process improvement. Right? If you're trying to change to a DevOps organization, if you're trying to say like, oh, this is worth doing, well, if you can't quantify that it's worth doing, that's going to be a pretty hard argument to make. And we can talk about change management, but that's a whole other discussion. The point being, though, what almost universally works is show small wins and then replicate them across the company, right? Generate buy-in, get some executives to say, yeah, let's try the DevOps thing. Do it with a couple of teams, prove that it works, hopefully. If you didn't prove that it works, well, you can always say, oh, that didn't work because the people weren't right. Or that didn't work because we didn't get the right processes in place, or whatever it happens to be. The technologies we were using weren't ready for it. But if it does work, they can easy proof point and say we should do more of this using the same kinds of platforms and technologies. So process improvement is a really important part of this, and one that's underappreciated, and also one that you can oftentimes use the same monitoring tools to monitor. Which makes it really easy. You don't have to use some kind of crazy HR process management thing. You can just use monitoring tools and throw any data into it you want to, and a lot of times people don't appreciate that. Right? You can monitor business data with this, you can monitor HR data with this, you can do whatever you want. And AWS Nagios is great. It's great because, well, of two reasons. One, it's basically the standard in monitoring. It's got its problems. But secondly, because Nagios happens to be based in St. Paul, which many of you probably didn't know. So if you're interested in buying Nagios support, they are about 15 miles away from here. But something I really appreciate about Nagios is it's been able to do monitoring at scale for a long time. And as per the stuff we just talked about, automation, CF Engine 1.0 came out in 1993. We are now 23 years later. It took us about 16 of those to figure out this whole DevOps idea. So none of these technologies are new. And so it was really changes elsewhere that made it happen, right? It was changes with primarily cloud that required us to make these changes in terms of automation and scalability and transience, right? We were just sitting around with a couple hundred servers, we didn't really have to automate. So Nagios was, when I think about it, where it all started, for good and for bad. And so we've seen things changing over time. We've seen a lot of hatred for tools like Nagios because they're a little bit clunky, they're a little bit pixelated. I think, I've said this before, when you look at the logos for some of these tools, you really get a good sense of what their design sensibilities are. And some of them, maybe typed out text, some of them may be a little bit better designed. Like they had somebody thinking about UX involved in the process somewhere. And it's crazy, right? It's not customer facing. Why would you involve a UX expert? Why would you bring in a designer for that? Well, that's changed. And it's changed for a lot of reasons. One of them is that at leading edge cloud providers today, we're asking SREs, basically DevOps engineers, site reliability engineers, to do things like maintain 10,000 servers per person. You can't do that if you don't have a good UX, right? This is the cheapest possible fix, right? Hire a designer for a couple of days or a week. It's the cheapest possible fix to make that kind of scaling possible, make it work. And so we've seen that happening over the last couple of years, although what's a little bit surprising is we've seen it happening in the open source community more so than in the corporate community, right? Because open source is not typically well known for being well-designed and easy to use software. I've spent, 13 years as an open source developer myself, so I'm very familiar with poorly designed software and designing poorly designed software myself. But we've seen things move on from sort of pixelated, like we've got pixelated logo, we've got pixelated graphics, whether it's graphite or tactile or what have you, to the new school of things like the elk stack, things like Sensu, right, which are bringing new sensibilities, both in terms of design, but also in terms of that test versus cattle metaphor, right? They can handle transients, which becomes increasingly important once we get that containers idea. So they can handle servers showing up and disappearing, they can handle scale, they understand what to do with alerts when there's 10,000 a minute showing up. And I saw this illustrated very graphically the other day when I saw a video of somebody's Instagram account who had 8 million followers, and they just showed what their iPhone lock screen looked like when they turned on push notifications. And it's just constantly like, you couldn't read anything. And that's what it looks like if you imagine turning on monitoring notifications for Netflix. Turning on monitoring notifications, I guess, in town here, probably for SPS would look the same way. I mean, none of our other public cloud companies. But things have changed, right? We've had people to scale. This came about first with log management, about a decade ago with things like Splunk, more recently with new style monitoring products. So that's why companies across the board have been able to do DevOps. And this is just another example of some ammunition I want to give you. Right? This is these are all companies via DPM, who's an excellent researcher around DevOps. But you pick your industry, it doesn't matter. There's somebody doing DevOps in it, right? Whether it's Target or Lego of all companies, right? Or government, universities, finance. prospects are things like startups, web companies, vendors. It's well beyond that at this point. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but what I do find interesting is that, so Puppet ran a survey of like 9,000 people a couple years back, asking about what they were doing with DevOps. And I went back to the folks who ran it and I said, I'm not sure that's universally true that anybody can do DevOps. And so I'd love to dig into the data. And they did, fortunately, they listened to me and they said, we'll go dig in. And so here, you probably can't read the numbers, but on the vertical axis is the size of the company. On the horizontal is basically a percent of DevOps practices they were able to do, as defined by the Puppet ThoughtWorks folks who ran this survey. And the important point here is small shops who cared about DevOps were about 40% likely to be doing it already, right? Which is the green bars there toward the bottom. Large shops who care about DevOps were about 20% likely to be doing it already. And so it's harder for large companies to do DevOps. The point I should come about this though is that it's not impossible, right? DevOps is not something that's unique to unicorns, to web companies, to vendors, to startups, anything like that. Anybody can do it. It just takes dedication. It takes more dedication with large companies because they move slower. So that's the DevOps stuff. Now I want to spend, how long do you want to spend talking about this stuff? We can talk more, we can hang out.
Containers.
Or Docker. Yes. All right. So containers. I've got a little bit more data in here too for you with DevOps fanatics. So containers. I'm not going to spend really any time on this. Does anybody? Well, if anybody wants to talk about what containers are, come and find me afterwards, and we can talk about it. I'm just going to assume you all know what Docker or LXC or joint containers, storage zones, whatever are. Oh yeah, Nano Server, Hyper-V, they've got it. But the important point about containers is that they advance what we've done with VMs to the next level, which is automation, right? Vagrant showed us that we could automate VM creation. Vagrant, Packer being really examples, VM creation, VM provisioning from the ground up. And containers took that to the next level. With Docker creating Docker files, right? Which are, Docker as a whole, Docker files as a whole, is really just a pretty wrapper around functionality that mostly already existed. But funny, we talked about this earlier, making things easy creates adoption. And so Docker came along just at the right time to say, wow, we really need to move faster, we really need to scale, and we need to do so easily. Oh, hey, here's this container thing. All right, done. And so along came Docker, right? Which is Docker files basically let you use a bash script to define what's in a container. I think something really important to remember about this is that bash script does not mean you don't have to care about package management. It does not mean you don't have to care about configuration management. It just lets you create a container. And so that doesn't mean, oh, hey, I don't have to care about Puppet or Chef or whatever anymore. I've got Docker now. Well, yeah, you do, but have you guaranteed what's in there? It changes the role of those processes, no question about it, right? Because if you're moving on to the container-driven approach, in many cases you're moving on to an idea called immutable infrastructure, right? Of basically create it once, bake it once you deploy it. You never change the infrastructure. Because if you're gonna make a change, you change it in the code that defines it, rebake, redeploy. There's no such thing as long-term maintained infrastructure anymore. It's always deployed fresh. And when you're deploying it fresh, you have to have the tooling to do it scalably and consistently. And that's where things like package management, configuration management come into it, because a bash script is neither scalable nor consistent. And that little orange robot in there, that's, even those of you who are formally DevOps may not have heard that. Who's heard of Auto? All right, about 10%. So Auto is, it was announced at HashiConf, which is the folks who created Vagrant and Packer last fall, and it was created to be the next generation of Vagrant that also supports containers and also supports deployment, not just creation. So you might be interested in that thing if you haven't seen it yet. And yeah, for those front row hecklers talking about Windows all night long, here's your Windows slide. So we moved beyond containers alone to say, well, all right, we have containers, but we're in this cattle versus pest world. We've got to deal with scale, we've got to deal with management. Because once you've got 1,000 of them, you can't just maintain them by hand. Once you've got more than 100, really, you can't maintain them by hand. And so now we've got container native operating systems. You pick your vendor of choice, they've probably got one for you. And the first to market was probably CoreOS, which I've been a Gen 2 Linux developer for a long time. They're loosely based on Gen 2, and so I have a appreciation for them. But Red Hat has Atomic, Ubuntu has Snappy, VMware came out with a Photon platform if you're a VMware fan, and Windows has Nano Server. So across the board, whatever your OS of choice, whatever your distro of choice, there's something for you. And I think it is really important, though, to emphasize that what you said is right? We spent a long time talking about how Windows kind of got left behind in this DevOps movement, and that's no longer the case. And that's really significant because about half of all deployments are Windows. So if you can bring them along the ride, you can apply the same philosophies but not the same tools. And more, you can even just apply the same tools, right? Things like Barbara and Chef run on Windows, Nano Server gives you container native operating system for Windows, the Windows Server 2016 tech preview and Windows 10 will give you Docker on Windows. And so you've not just got the same approaches, now you've got the same tools. And so don't feel like they have to get left behind and be like some kind of manual help desk thing while all the Linux people are doing the cool stuff that's scalable and automatable and cloud native. That's not how it works anymore. So here's some metrics looking at developer interest, right? I went out there, you can do actually data mining on Stack Overflow, pretty popular discussion forum, and I looked at a bunch of different container-related projects, whether they were containers themselves like Docker, or container-native operating systems, or container orchestration and management like Kubernetes or Mesos. And the only important point out of this, I don't really expect you to read 90% of this, is you can see how quickly that purple line has taken off over the past couple of years, which is a good indicator of developer interest in Docker. Right? Containers have been around for 15 years on Linux alone. That's ignoring things like Solaris and BSD. But it wasn't until they got easy and until it was the right time in the cloud movement and the DevOps movement that things really picked up. But the question I've always had when I saw the slide was, that was one, was what does this look like in real companies? Because like it's all cute that people are asking questions about it, and maybe they're playing with it at night and they're having a wine or whatever. What happens during their day jobs, right? And so we've been asking survey questions about containers for about a year now. Here's a couple of quarters. We've got quarter 1 and quarter 3 from 2013. It takes a little bit of time to process, so quarter 3 is basically brand new stuff that we just came out with on Christmas. It's only 2 weeks old. And if you look at container adoption over time, the points I want to focus on are sort of the middle ones there, which are dev test, initial implementation of prod, and prod. And in 2 quarters, so in half a year, basically all of those doubled. Now, something that's interesting about this, and something that really reflects, I think, the technology adoption stances of companies and whether they think about themselves as software companies as a whole, is what's going on with the discovery and evaluation part, because that almost got cut in half over the course of that same 6 months. And I think what's happening is half of those were deciding containers is something we gotta do. Half of those are saying we're not there yet, we don't buy it, so we're gonna wait. And that's why you see that no plans and down at the bottom starting to increase over time. Charlie.
Donnie, second interruption, but I don't know if I can disclose that, but the issue on Docker was it's still looking country ready for that change.
According to whom? I think that's the question, right? Just because a vendor says it's not product ready doesn't mean nobody's going to deploy it, right? Like, oh, it's not one yet. That means we're not selling support yet, right? Yeah, I think so. So the point was basically, oh, I heard Docker wasn't production ready yet. And the response basically being, well, yeah, maybe so, but people deploy anyways, right? I think production ready is a definition employed by the vendor who wants to make money off stuff. Production ready has a very different definition for mature IT organizations who are willing to test things themselves. And it takes a lot of effort to do so, right? If you're going to do something like continuous deployment, deploying software every day or more often, you have to have a very mature testing environment. And one that pertains to the software you're building on top, but also that pertains to the platform underneath. And if you trust that environment, you shouldn't really have to care what a vendor says about something. You can pull in things whenever you feel like it. But I think the interesting point here is 22%, 23% really, if you round up, of organizations using cloud, which is 87% of them by our metrics, had Docker in prod by some definition in Q3 of last year, which is an enormously large number. When I think about it, when I'm like, all right, Docker, that's 2.5, almost 3 years old now, 2.5 years old. And 1 in 5 companies, anywhere on the cloud, SaaS, IaaS, PaaS, have already deployed Docker. That really incredible to me. I mean, that really says something for what user friendliness gives you and what being timely to market in terms of hitting cloud, hitting DevOps gives you. And people really buy into the agility that the containers give you. So this is something that I hope, if you're new to DevOps, you can take home with you. If you're old to DevOps, you can also take home with you. So this is, like I said, we try and track metrics across the market. We'll try and wrap up in the next 5 to 10 minutes here. We have other priorities. I think I like to track IT technology adoption stances across companies because it gives me a good metric on when they're going to take up their early stuff versus when they're going to hit mainstream. And what we saw with this one was, companies that said they're on the leading edge had already picked it up by Q1 of last year. About 10% of them had already deployed some kind of Dockerized app to prod. And we're not moving beyond that. So I think we're going to see a lot more companies picking up Docker over the course of the next year or so, because we're going to be hitting those 2 really big bars in the middle. So we talked about fragmentation at the beginning. And this is the last thing I want to talk about is a little bit of microservices. Because you've got to talk about microservices these days. Fragmentation means using different technologies all the time. It means a return to the Unix philosophy in a way, using the best tool for the job. If you're using the best tool for every job, that gives you a lot of fragmentation within your company. How do you rationally maintain that kind of fragmentation? You have to compartmentalize the technologies. And then you end up with something that looks a lot like microservices, right? You pick the right technology for the right job for each service. And then the next service over doesn't have to care. And that's why I think fragmentation over the last 20 years naturally led to something that looks a lot like microservices. Over the last 10 years, we saw SOA gradually lead to microservices as people said, oh, well, Java's kind of enterprise, and XML sucks. It'd be nice if we had something easier, like REST and JSON. And the guy who I'm showing up there, that is not actually me 10 years ago. That's a guy named Steve Yegi. And Steve Yegi worked at Amazon, they moved to Google. And he wrote a memo that he intended to post on the internal Google Plus after he moved to Google. Fortunately for the internet and the world, Google Plus is not known for its good UX. So he accidentally posted it to the entire internet. So we were able to benefit from his knowledge. And what he said was, according to him, Jeff Bezos, who runs Amazon, said many, many years ago that every transfer of data within Amazon must be through an API, or you're fired. All right, so there's a pretty clear take home there. Like, I guess we're gonna have to do that API thing. We can't just email spreadsheets because I'd like to keep my job. Right? And if you don't provide a very clear and powerful consequence, people have no incentive to do things. But if you do, then they do. And so Steve Yegi, this memo came out, I think it was in 2013, has driven a lot of the transition to microservices because people have seen the pace at which Amazon has been able to release new products in AWS, and they've said, I want to be like that. How do I do that? And they've taken this memo home, and in fact, late last year, we finally saw some original journalism came out corroborating this, right? Amazon finally said, oh yeah, that is something we did. And so we've seen a lot of people move toward this microservices idea of trying to say, all right, we're going to define technologies within a certain point and create an API around it and say this is a loosely bounded context. And on top of that, we're going to create a loosely bounded team, which I think ties this really back into DevOps. How do we organize the teams to support DevOps, to support microservices? And here's a quote from some folks at Gilbert that took this microservices approach. I forget exactly how many services they created, but they moved from something in sort of the teens to something in the hundreds over the course of a year and a half or so. And I've heard that so many times at this point, not just from startups that I'll show you up here, but also from enterprises. One of the most recent ones I heard was Aetna Insurance Group. I've also heard it from Adobe. I mean, large companies at this point. It's not just the domain of early adopters and startups anymore. More and more companies are starting to hear about this approach. So Gilbert, taking that DevOps approach to reorg the teams to support microservices. The question and the problem I hear a lot of companies running into right now is saying, oh, yeah, we would love to create these API-defined, loosely bounded services that we can deploy to independently. Now, how do we do that? Because that sounds kind of terrifying and terrible at the same time. And in reality, it looks a lot like that too. Because now you've created 150 different problems to monitor and manage and bug fix. And you've got to figure out how to scale that. And so we've seen some software coming out more recently, over the past couple of years here. Mesos being a good example of the underlying sort of firmament, if you will, right? We're saying we need container management, right? Mesos and Kubernetes are examples of that. On top of that, you need things like service discovery and secrets management, all these sorts of things that if you've got a service, you need something like that. If you've got one service, you might just sort of do it in a one-off way. If you've got 150, you can't do it in a one-off every time. And so you've got to figure out, all right, that's got to be its own microservice now. All right, so now we've got a vault service, for example, for secret management. And now we've got things that look like microservices SDKs emerging. Mantle up there and Apollo are two examples of this. Where they say, all right, we've picked a set of technologies that seem to work really well for us. We're working with our customers. Mantle came out of the Meta Cloud group at Cisco. Apollo came out of Capgemini, a pretty large SI in case you're not familiar with them. And then we've got container services on top of that, more and more schedulers, more and more higher level orchestration. Because people are trying to figure out how do we scale this, how do we get there, because we want to be able to deploy independently. And why should we do that? Because it lowers the risk of each deployment. Right? This goes back to what we were talking about at the very beginning. How do you lower effective risk? Well, if you're deploying 10,000 lines of code, you've got 10,000 lines of risk. There's no way to avoid that. But how do you lower the impact of that risk? Is you compartmentalize it as much as possible, both from an architectural perspective and then from a deployment perspective as well, which is something we're not going to have time to get into. So here's a few examples, Netflix being the boring one. Software AG, I like this one because they're a company so old that they're basically called Software Incorporated. Before software was a common enough word that people used it. They created basically a microservices architecture behind a ton of kiosk and POS systems. Sorry. Halo is a sort of taxi hailing startup. And here's actually some economic metrics that I like. In that they saw, after they went to microservices, which is this vertical bar about here, they saw the number of jobs completed dramatically increase, and they saw the cost per job dramatically decrease because they were able to make better use of the resources they were paying for. Here's another example, a real estate company that's been around for longer than you might think based on the sort of website name. And they ran into a couple of interesting problems. One was that they didn't see a test suite. And so what they did, fortunately for us, is they created their own in the open source bit. And they also ran into a very common problem with microservices, which is, what does micro actually mean? We know it's supposed to be not a monolith, but we're not really sure if we make that like one API call or 17, or what's the number it looked like there. And I think that's still an unanswered question, but it's one that what we're trying to answer with now is this idea called domain-driven design. And the way I think about it is, when I think about what a domain looks like, I think about a business domain, right? And I say, all right, you've got the finance folks over there somewhere, and they should create a finance microservice, because nobody outside of that team knows what finance means, and so they can't effectively design an API or support API. And so on for teams across the board. And finally, the last example that I want to talk about is, and very briefly again, is Seatrip, which is a Chinese travel site, so it's like a kayak or something like that. And they kind of approached it from the opposite perspective, a very pragmatic view, if you will, in that they said, all right, we're going to create these microservices, but we're going to think about Conway's along the opposite way. And that we understand that things are going to segment along organizational boundaries, and we're going to create microservices to suit that. And so we're going to fit things into the way we work, which gives us the knowledge to understand how to maintain the microservices we have, and we can gradually iterate them over time to create the microservices we want. Which I think is a pretty, not the idealistic way to think about it, but a very pragmatic way to think about it. And so finally, here's just a list of some of the practices that I think about when I'm talking to people about how do you produce modern IT across the board, whether it's architecture, product, or somewhere in the middle. And hopefully, actually, if you disagree with any of these, I'd love to hear it. Because we could have a good argument over some fine beverages with that. Oh, thanks. Yeah, the question being, what's the difference between delivery and deployment? When I think about continuous delivery, I think about producing an environment that is ready to deploy. That is delivery. I have delivered the environment. Deployment means my customers see that environment. And so continuous delivery guarantees that your packaging process works. Continuous deployment means that your customers are impacted by that. So it's very easy for companies to talk about, oh yeah, we're going to do continuous deployment because our product is basically a website. And that's great. But continuous delivery is something that's possible for almost anybody, right? And you can say, oh, this works on our internal products, right? Whether we're HP making printers or Digi making some kind of little cute things with Zigbee or whatever, right? We've created the firmware, the OS, the entire process that's ready to deploy to our consumers. And that's delivery. Deployment is they've got it, right? And as we think about things like IoT, that becomes a very important distinction. So with that, I've gone a little bit over time, but I hope it was interesting to you. If we can stay in space for a little while, I'd love to take a few questions. Thank you. Yeah.
Sure. Where do you see most of the pushback coming from? Let me give you examples. I've heard pushback from PCI security standpoint, saying that you need silos in order to prevent internal hacking.
Right. I think, yeah, so the question was basically along the lines of security and do we need silos to prevent things like internal hacking for the purposes of PCI. Is that accurate?
That was just an example.
Right.
The main thing is what do you see pushback?
Right.
And the relevant barriers for those sorts of things.
Okay, so where do we see the pushback coming from? With security as an example. Most of the pushback comes from people who tend to not fully understand what could be if you move to a fully DevOps approach. In that, I mean, security as an example, right? In that is say, oh, well, you can't be secure if everybody's got access. And you say, well, the secrets are all managed in a secrets service, which only the production servers have access to, for example. And everything else that gets deployed is easily audited because it is all defined in code. And so it's it's a very highly trackable process, much more so than manually maintained infrastructure. So as the security example, auditing becomes even easier as we move to DevOps. Secrets management becomes easier as we move to DevOps. The pushback most often tends to be the one that I run into now, because we're a long ways in at this point. The ones that I run into now tend to be things like governance reasons, for example. Like, I just talked to a company recently that said, oh, well, we handle top secret data. We're not legally allowed to let it leave our premises. And so we can't do cloud. And I say, all right, well, fortunately, DevOps is a prerequisite for cloud. It is not only available in cloud, and so you can still do DevOps without cloud, right? It's certainly easier if you have some kind of virtualization environment with an API, no question about it, but that can still work on-prem. Another piece of pushback we kind of get is things like, and more things like, I forget the word for it, but like the data laws that passed in the EU about where the data can go. Yeah, safe harbor stuff. Is that you can create provisions that allow for it here, but they tend to be more challenging. And so you have to say, well, all right, if we're deploying to, again, it's a public cloud thing primarily. If we're deploying to public cloud, we need to make sure that none of this data leaves Germany, for example. And as long as the cloud makes a provision for that, you can do so. But with DevOps as a whole, it's not, you can still do DevOps on-prem. You can still do DevOps in a colo. You don't need to do cloud to do DevOps, although, as I said, you have to do DevOps to do cloud effectively. Yeah, why don't we do one more question?
Out of the information that you've captured, apologies for accent, have you been able to gauge the time from transition that people move from I'm just putting towing into the water into now where really feel comfortable with something? You've been able to gauge an average time and say, hey, we can do this now.
Right, yeah, that's a good question. So the question was basically, what does the timeline look like for DevOps adoption? And that is a question that I would love to have the answer to, and I don't. In fact, the one that I really want to ask is just some kind of across the board, what it look like step by step, and exactly what was your DevOps process as you move down the road. I've got that sort of thing anecdotally, but I don't have that from I asked 1,000 different companies and they gave me the answer. Anecdotally, I would say it depends on what success looks like. People in the community tend to say you've never reached DevOps. It's always a journey and not an end. But if you set a goal, something along the lines of, all right, we are at quarterly deployments today and we would like to be at weekly deployments, for example. You can set a reasonable timeline for that of all right, every, let's say, a year and a half from now, we want to be at weekly deployments. And 6 to 12 months from then, we want to be at daily deployments. Because every one of those, you have to think about the process changes involved to get there. Because it's never just we'll automate one more thing. It's actually, we have to take these humans and convince them that they still have a job in the new world, which is really challenging a lot. Because when you talk about server automation, for example, you say, all right, well, yeah, you used to just sit there and log into some terminal and run HTOP for a while and make sure everything looked good. And now you just automated 100 of you away, so what does your job look like? Because that's, in terms of your question to you, what produces the pushback is people who are afraid that their jobs are going to disappear, rather than realizing that IT always has more to do. And you can always just level up on that as long as you're willing to learn new things.
Yes, again.
Right.
So, actually, actually, that was my question, but to follow up with that, because you answered that very well, thank you. What is the best way, because when you get that pushback, because I work with small to mid-level companies, doing business analysis and helping them to see how IT can kind of speed things up for them. What is the best way for me to demonstrate to them that they really do need this? That without it, they wouldn't be able to get out to their customers, like the delivery systems and all that stuff, take a hit.
Yeah, great question. You're on the mic, so I don't have to repeat it, which is better. So how do you do that? I mean, the best example tends to be pointing at case studies, right? They're saying, here are these industries who have been affected. Here are companies who have gone out of business because they couldn't cope. With one that comes top of mind being Netflix versus Blockbuster Video. Blockbuster Video was there first, and they didn't have the process maturity, right? They had the product, but they couldn't iterate fast enough because they didn't have a DevOps process in place to deal with it. Or, you could look at Tesla is not the first electric car. They are the first to be able to deliver live updates while you're on the road, which is frightening in an entirely different way. iPhone is not the first software phone. Right? Yeah, but it does give you that sort of software level flexibility where you can update over time. And as frequently as you want, as long as you can get approved by the App Store. So yeah, I think as much as I love data, I was trained as a scientist. Anecdotes and stories tend to be more powerful in convincing people. And I try and couple the data with illustrations of that data whenever I can, which is why I talk about things like net capital and like those microservices examples. Great. I don't know what your plan is for the night, but I'll be hanging around for a while and then migrating probably somewhere nearby until at least an hour from now.